I want to welcome everybody to the show, and we have a returning guest today on the show, and his name is Mike J Powell, and he's out in Henderson, Nevada, and he's just released a new book, and we're going to talk about that book, and we're going to talk about the sixth sense of detectives. And Mike has been in the detective world for a long, long time, and he has a couple books out there that represent this lifestyle, and we're just going to get a feel of the sixth sense and what that means to him and so forth. So I welcome you to the show, Mike. How you doing?
Thank you. I'm doing fine.
Yeah, we were just talking a little bit. You mentioned, when you sent this email over talking about the sixth sense, you have native bloodline, right?
Right.
Spanish. Tell me a little bit about, has this been a new thought process? Was this something that you thought about in the middle of the action, or is this something you're looking back on now and realized, hey, maybe I do have something special?
Well, after writing my first book, as you could see it there, Escaping the Kill Zone, I realized a lot of things about myself that that were actually, you might say they're special. I'm dyslexic, very dyslexic. I grew up dyslexic, but I always knew I had another sense about things. Recently, I wrote a fiction book called The Fabulous Mickey Finn, and it is a thriller. And my character, I had more license. My first book's about me and my law enforcement career. The second book is about a detective I created doing real cases that I've drawn from. Because he was fictional, I was allowed to do things with him that I felt I didn't want to broach in the first book. And then after talking to you and thinking about it, I thought, there are a lot of things that police officers, military and stuff, we have that, as you mentioned, sixth sense, that you imagine going on the witness stand and testifying. One in particular case, I was standing in front of the police station and in uniform when I was a rookie, and a car drove by and the passenger looked at me. We made eye contact, and I knew something was very wrong. I mean, I felt it in my gut. And so when my training officer came out, I was writing down the license plate. It was a Texas license plate. And he says, "What do you got?" I go, "There's something wrong there." And he goes, "Oh, what'd they do?" I said, "I can't explain it. It's something wrong." And we got behind him and we tailed him for a while. We ran the plate. It takes a little while back then because it's a out-of-state Texas plate. Then all of a sudden it starts beeping, the radio beeping, and everyone's notified that these guys are just robbed and killed the bank guard in a bank in Texas. They had just gotten off the freeway a half a block from the police station in Newton Division. And so we chased them down. We had an accident. We got back in the car. I was talking to air unit. Finally, they crashed and jumped out of the car with bank bags and guns. It was really interesting. But when I had to explain what happened, I never included the eye contact thing. And thinking back after writing my books, I realized there's a lot of that goes on that we as police officers don't mention because it's kind of frowned on, it laughed at, or you imagine a defense attorney or tearing you apart for some kind of sixth sense you had. But I believe all human beings have it, not to the same level. Some are, have mastered it, you might say, more than others.
Mm-hmm.
Those are things that's been going through my mind lately.
Well, when you say that, there's something that's kind of linear to what you said, is like the dyslexia. Like I've always been able to rationale things. And I think that's part of it. If you have a different rationale than most people, if you're dialed in, and then it's almost like I would always write like words in reverse. Like I would get to a part in a sentence and I would put one word before the other word, but I wouldn't say them that way. You know what I'm saying? But I would write that way.
Right.
So there's something linear to that. And then you think about the quantum field, which is never talked about. And this is a big deal for me. Like I'm kind of, I've kind of found a way to have science really use the material that they've put out and use it against them to kind of make them understand the quantum field, because because, science only uses two parts of law of attraction to determine answers for humanity. And that's unfortunate when there's three parts of law of attraction. So if you're using 67% of law of attraction to determine answers for humanity, you're not going to get the right answers. That's why we've created this realm of physics. There's not the correct realm of physics. The correct realm of physics is the realm of physics that God created, which is the quantum field. So I think when you understand that, which I think there's departments in the government that understand that, right? And maybe they keep these departments separate. Like if you take the CIA, they've used some of these tactics, supposedly, hearsay. We don't know what's true or not true. But when you look at the CIA, they've used this type of stuff. And then you look at, normality, law enforcement, they're not allowed to use that type of stuff. Do you think that could be by design? Right?
Well, I think that probably the FBI and the CIA have the same problems we do as just regular human beings, saying you have some kind of special ability that the masses don't have, or they haven't developed it, or they're too lazy to understand it and move it forward. 2 years ago, I was at a master homicide class in Washington, D.C. It's a week long and put on by the FBI and the International Homicide Investigation Association, which I'm a member. The FBI did talk briefly about remote drawing, that they had things going. Also, years ago, I took a class from Tony Mendez. Tony Mendez, he's written a couple books. He passed away a few years ago. Tony Mendez, they made a movie about him called Argo. He was the master of disguise for the FBI, and he gave a class at UCLA. It was Espionage 101. And he talked about a lot of things that the CIA, he was, of course, from the CIA, and it was sanctioned to give the class. And he talked about a lot of things that the CIA are developing and looking into, and probably, in my estimation, not utilizing it in the open. You've kind of, just like police officers, you see something, you feel something, you walk in a room and you feel this guy is, there's something wrong here going on. And then something happens and you react. You're not going to, as I said earlier, you're not going to come out and say in a court of law, yeah, I felt a vibe coming from him and I watched him that, made me lock onto him. I don't know if you've ever done this, but you ever like shake hands with someone and get an eerie feeling?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or I know, I don't know. I can read somebody usually in about 10 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
It's real quick. It's real quick. And it's almost like it's not a manifestation at all. It's just pops in my head. Mm-hmm. Or like I can be diarrhea of the mouth and not even know what I'm saying. And it just comes out. But what I say is meant for that person. So I think sometimes, there is information coming through whatever lineage you have. And then if you do understand the quantum field and how we're all connected, right? Because if you look at a collective and you play the percentage game, you can look at things that, that happen in society where if you create a big enough narrative, right, that percentage game of that narrative is going to have a certain play in everybody that hears that narrative. That's how they're able to get the masses to move like they're able to get the masses to move. If you look at the political system, I think the political system is somewhat like a Cain and Abel type story. The two bloodlines, they're two separate human beings, right? Because one bloodline is attracted to this tone and another bloodline is attracted to this tone. Why is that? Maybe there's somebody that knows that, and maybe that's their advantage to say, hey, if we put out this pocket narrative, we know that this side's going to respond like this. If we put out this pocket narrative, we know that this side's going to respond like this, and vice versa. Do you think there's a foundation out there that has this information, right, in this kind of limited society from using it, right, and use it to their advantage?
I do, but I also think there's some basic things that hinder people from seeing things one way versus the other way. A person's perception is a different than someone's perspective. So most people, I don't know how many times, we talk about a murder case I did or something, people say, oh, he would have never done that. Well, they're coming from their perspective. And also, I look at people and I think, why do they think like that? And they think like that because they've been indoctrinated since they were children on not how to think, but what to think. Our clergy, our parents, our teachers. So by the time you grow up, you're in this lane over here, and it's hard to break away because there's much more over here you could look at and make your own decision about what you're trying to look at closely. But a lot of people won't or can't let go and look over there because they can't look at the perspective of what's going on in the world. Yeah, but scouts have to do that in military. They have to do that instinctively. What's wrong here? How do I move? Where should I sit? Where should I move? And I mean, even now, I wrote my book and there's some very harrowing things in the book. I've had, people killed in front of me. The hardest thing to deal with are the kids that were murdered. And one murdered in front of me, 12 feet apart, a baby. And so after I wrote it, I started going back to therapy. And I talked to my therapist, and I remember one day going in there and said, I can't stop what I see. I'm bombarded with stuff that I see all the time, and it's exhausting. I hear things, I see things that I believe most people I've been around don't even notice. And like I'll walk in a place and look at stuff. I don't plan it. It just comes. I can tell if they're left-handed or right-handed. I can tell if they have a knee problem, a hip problem, just by the way they tie their shoe. There's a lot of things that pop in my mind, which I don't want popping in my mind because my wife and I are there for lunch or dinner. But I instinctively look and gather as much information about people around me. And it sometimes interferes with me relaxing and doing what we want to do is just enjoy dinner together. And so I told her, I said, I get exhausted. And at times my wife travels for work. And so she'll go away for a couple of days. And probably if she's gone for 3 days, one of the days I'll just close the blinds and I'll be inside with no TV on, nothing. And I write. I just kind of tune out the world, recharge my battery, as you will. And, but I see a lot. And I think that's the reason I've had people read my book and say, wow, you did so many different big things. And if I look back and put them together like I did in the book, it almost seems unreal. But, in a span of over 10 years, you look at them and you think, well, it's all in the same field. So it's law enforcement, regardless of how big it is and how small it is. But the thing I had the ability to do was look at things. And like when I wanted to cover the mafia, I was told by the Fed, I was hired to go undercover into the Las Vegas mafia and work with the federal government. The first thing the younger federal agents that met me when I flew into Vegas was they spent 20 minutes telling me how I'd never infiltrate the organization. I'm sure they're coming from the perspective of you have to be sponsored to get in. Number two, and the operation that was going down, there were 200 employees. In the lunchroom were like 2 to 3 mobsters from Chicago who were there all day long. How are you going to get in there? It'll take you years. But I never thought like they thought. I thought like, well, I'm not going to go ask to get in there. They're going to ask me to come in here. To perspective, by the end of the week, they laughed at me when I told them I'll be in by the end of the week. They laughed and picked up their briefcases and left. But 3 days later, I was sitting in the lunchroom with the mobsters.
Interesting. Well, I think it's a look too. Like, where you're in a part of a city, right? And you're walking down the street and you notice a guy and he may not be, there might be something under that hat per se. And he just kind of gives you a nod. I think there's only some people that can do that recognize I call it game recognizes game. So, I definitely believe what you're saying. Have you ever been walking down the street and a guy will notice you and you notice them and you're like, and that guy's not, he might want to do some bad things, but he's probably not going to mess with a guy like you if you have the nod look.
Right. Yeah, I've had that happen. And a lot of people, I'm 5'9", it's 170 pounds. And a lot of people go, you were undercover in the mafia. It was the largest bust in U.S. postal history in mail fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. It brought 100 federal agents in the Dallas Air Force Base, and I was the only undercover person. I was 28 years old. And most people, the first thing they do is they look at you and go, you? Because I'm 5'9", 170 pounds. But the reality is, if I was 6'4" and 220, they would have their guard up.
Mm-hmm.
It's instinctual with men. You're bigger than me, my guard goes up. If he's smaller than you, your guard is down because it doesn't feel like a threat or that he can be a threat. And of course, I'm talkative, and I could talk my way out of anything. It's just the way I was born.
Interesting. Now, do you have any lineage in your family that had some spiritual things going on, or like you had an aunt or great grandmother had some special ability?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, my great grandparents were very religious Catholic from Mexico. As a kid, we went to church my grandmother took us to church every Sunday and that kind of stuff. And, she believed in very spiritual things, but she pretty much kept it to herself. She lived with us growing up. She had her own room. She was always, don't say this or don't say that, don't do that because it can come back on you, those kind of things, which most people say. But I know nothing special like the feeling we're talking about, like an empath or something like that I know of. She might have, but never discussed it. A lot of these things that we're discussing nowadays, you didn't discuss back then.
Well, did you ever feel like you're in another world?
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? Like, because all the time, like I always talk about what's in my head. I wrote a book called Finding a Perfect Audience, and it basically, the book I wrote is universal. It's linear to everything and everybody. And I think it can change the world because it can reset humanity, right? It can reset a business. It can reestablish a business the right way. And I have all this stuff in my head and I talk about it and I normalize it within myself, but then I catch myself thinking that other people know what I'm talking about and they have no idea. Did you experience that in the police, the police world?
Yes, I did. Like, as I said earlier, I kept that stuff to myself. It's like, I was in Hollywood and I went in, I was going to have a meeting and, it was like 9 a.m. and a big 5 store was next door, sporting goods store. So I decided I'm early. I'm going to wander around and look at things and stuff. And as I walked to the place, the parking lot was on the side. There was a car sitting there running. There was a gentleman in the driver's seat. And I thought, there's something going on here. I walk inside and there's a guy wandering around in sweats and it's about 103 degrees, and he has long sleeve sweats and everything and he's sweating, but he kept using his wrist to pull up his pants on his hip. He's armed.
Mm-hmm.
I knew that, and everything just kind of comes together. And part of it, some people say, is training. Part of it's how I grew up in a neighborhood. We had gangs. I was shot at when I was 10. I was shot at when I was like 14, 15 years old. And you learn to survive. You learn to hear noises, and you learn to sense this is trouble. This person's trouble. I captured a serial killer, young one, about 19, 20 years old. And when I grabbed him from behind, and when I pulled his arms around and handcuffed him, when I turned him around, I looked in his eyes, and it was one of the scariest feelings I've ever felt. It was pitch black, but it had some depth to it, like, almost like no one's home, but it felt like it was drawing you.
Yeah.
And also the thing, one of the things I wrote in my book, when I was a rookie, my partner and I were in South Central LA. We get a mundane call, some kids throwing rocks at an abandoned house. So we go there and it's plywood's boarded up all the windows and doors. And it's in the heart of South Central Los Angeles. So we go around and the plywood on the back door was pulled up a little. So I pulled it and I said, hey, the kids might have got in here. Let's go take a look. So I crawl in, my partner crawls in behind me, and we walk around, and probably up to your calf muscles, just trash, newspapers, beer bottles, aluminum cans, just, and so he said, you get the bedrooms and the bathroom, I'll get the living room and kitchen. And I go in and there's shards of light coming in. And I'm using a flashlight, a 5-cell cal light. And I'm look at the first bedroom around. I just take a step in, nothing. I yell, clear. I go to the bathroom. There's no curtain. I look in the tub. There's no curtain. Clear. And as I walk to the second bedroom, I just got ready to put my light in and he yelled, clear. And he was done. So I kind of just used my flashlight to kind of pan the top of the trash and I yelled, clear. And I don't know if you ever got that sensation you're standing on a cliff and it feels like something's pulling you over in your chest.
Yeah.
I had that feeling. And I remember saying, wait. And I panned through, nothing. There were shards of light coming into one location. And I bent over and I had combat boots on and I was kicking the trash out of the way. And then thud, my boot hit something. I moved the papers, I bent over, moved the papers, and it was a 9-year-old boy, just had been murdered, still warm. His chest was on the floor, but his head was turned around, looking at me with bright eyes, and he had a scarf tied around his neck. And there were some other things that I won't say on your show, but that sensation pulled me into that room, or we would have left him. We wouldn't have known. Then everything kind of escalated when the homicide detectives got there. I know they're processing and stuff, but I'm asking my partner, well, where are the other kids? There was like 6 of them. Where are the other kids? I used to play in abandoned homes like this. That's the kind of area I grew up in. He said, they'll find out. And then the driveway, the house was on a alleyway, and not a driveway, but an alleyway. And a man about 2 doors down on that side of the alley was in his backyard. He saw an old man run out of the building, the house, and jump in his truck and take off. He wrote down the license plate. So other detectives tracked it down. It wasn't registered to him, but I sold it to him, that kind of thing. And they tracked him down. Later, within about an hour and a half, we get word they have the murder suspect. He's at the station and he won't talk. He's not saying anything until he gets a lawyer. So we're on outer perimeter. I'm supposed to just keep the looky-loos back. So I walk over where the truck was parked. It was parked within 6 feet on the side of the building, on the lawn. And I'm thinking, that doesn't make sense. So I go back to my training officer. I said, hey, why would someone park this close if he knew he was going to murder a child? And he joked with me and, said, all right, Dick Tracy, we're just here to keep the people back. And I said, I'm looking for those kids. So I went across the street and I started asking people, and it led me 4 to 5 blocks away. And there was a man watering his lawn, and it was about maybe 1 or 2 in the afternoon, and a woman his wife sitting on the porch, and their chain link fence. I came over and I said, hey, you see a group of kids around here? And he goes, oh yeah, they live on this street down at the end down there. And he goes, they go down to those abandoned homes down there to play. It's summer and they don't have any place to play. And I said, well, tell me about them. He goes, a group, 5, 6 of them, they're 9 years old. And then he looked back at his wife and looked at me like he's getting permission. That's the feeling I got. And he said, except one. I said, tell me about that one. He looked back at her. He looked back and he goes, well, he's not really with them, but they do talk to him. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, he follows them. He stays about 15, 20 feet away from them. The group is laughing and joking with each other, and he follows them. And he's about 6 foot. He's about 17, 18, 19 years old. Then he looked at his wife and he looked back at me and he did this. He goes, he walks like Frankenstein. And I said, do you know where this guy lives? This kid lives? And he goes, yeah, that last house down there. So I go get my partner. I said, hey, let's go, let's do this and stuff. And he didn't want to. And I said, well, I'm going back. Well, back then we didn't have radios. We didn't have vests. We didn't have any of that stuff. So he said, well, let's take a police car. So at least we have a radio in them. So I drive down. He drives down and we pull up. And the first thing I noticed was there were courts, like 3 or 4. And, it's the inner city, except this first house was immaculate. Flower pot on each step, flower in each one. And the first feeling I got was overcompensation. It just stood out at me. So I went up, I knocked on the door, screen door, and a woman opened up, and she's in a church-going dress, you might say, it's Sunday. And she says, "Oh my God, not again." And I see a shadow jump up from the couch and run down the hallway. So I yanked the door off its hinges, actually, because it was locked. And my partner pushed her aside, and I chased the kid down the hallway, and he went in the bathroom and locked the door. Of course, I just busted the door open, and he was washing something in the sink. And I reached around and grabbed his wrists, pulled his hands apart, and I heard clunk like metal hitting the porcelain. I put his hands behind his back. I handcuff him. I look around, and here's the knife, and here's blood swirling down in the thing. So I turned the water off, and I walked him back. And it turns out what's so bizarre about this is when the lawyer came from the old man, the reason he wanted a lawyer is he was under the house stealing the copper plumbing, and the murder took place about 18 inches above his face. He said he can hear the kid squealing.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
I got off the subject. Sorry.
Wow. No, it's fine. It's fine. Interesting. Well, I mean, when you talk about the serial killer, you talk about this kid.
He had done it before when he was younger, a few years younger. He was institutionalized in New York. He got out, and they said he was fine. So his mother moved him to California for a fresh start. And he did it again.
Well, I had this experience, and I don't want to sound too hokey. I don't really talk about this, about low-level entities attaching through trauma, right? I mean, that's a real thing, because I kind of helped remove some entities from one of my cousins. And it just kind of happened. Don't know how I did it. It just kind of happened. But when you understand that low-level entities attach to trauma, and that's the only way they can survive. I mean, that's a real thing. I mean, I know the Bible speaks about heaven and hell, but I think these low-level entities are supposed to be hell, right? They don't quite make it, right? Because they didn't do what God wanted them to do. So this energy is left over. So if somebody goes through trauma, that energy will, and they're similar to this personality, they will attach to that and feed off that. So let's perpetuate that. Let's perpetuate that 5, 6, 7, 8 generations, right? So when you carry lineage trauma to the next generation and it's never fixed, and you keep compounding that. Now, this is just a theory I have, since I kind of understand this low-level energy thing, because you have, that lineage trauma is like a gash. And we can teach people, because your subconscious is programmed when you're a kid. And we could teach people, hey, if you run into this, this is what you have to do. Don't feed into this. Don't accept this, right? So if you don't, if you leave that lineage trauma and you don't deal with it, then it's going to keep carrying over, right? And I think I said that. But what I'm saying is, once you compound that with a certain human being, I think there's certain entities or individuals that have this compounding low-level entities attached to them that they're never going to cross back over. So it's like when you looked at this guy in the eye, you said it was dark, there was nothing there. And that's just a theory, but that rationale makes a lot of sense to me based on what you're saying about serial killers.
Yeah, it's... Do
you understand that? You understand that, what I'm saying with that?
I know trauma is hereditary. People from, generation to generation to generation, and how it manifests itself at each generation, I think depends on, nurture nature. And so, yeah, it's a very real thing. I'm thinking of my dad, because my dad, and he was abused as a kid, and his mother, told him he had to find his own way in life, and kicked him out of the house when he was 11. So he went in and out of foster care. And back then they had camps when he got a little older and stuff. And he was abused. He was beat up. He was stabbed. And I always had this connection with him. He always treated my brothers and I the same. They were straight A students, and I was dyslexic, and I had trouble in school. I mean, sent me to doctors. Doctors had me sit in a room every day during the summer, listen to classical music in the dark for an hour, had me doing, it was kind of a miserable. And the only one I felt like that understood me without he and I talking about it, because my dad didn't talk a lot, was my dad. And then these things I'm telling you that he went through, I didn't find out till years later. Most of it after he passed away. Then my mother opened up. But yeah, the trauma that he endured as a child, I think I got some of it. I was bullied at school. I was, I guess in a way that trauma is a target, because I was targeted by the bullies. And I always wondered, why me? Why are they targeting me and not him or not her? And some kind of thing we send out, we're damaged, that we're weak, that we're something.
Well, it's what it is to me is, even if you have this lineage trauma, that's a sensibility, or that feeling of a trauma is a feeling you experienced. So if you haven't dealt with it, or it hasn't been dealt with properly, we are attracted to that feeling. Unknowingly, our unconscious bias is attracted to that feeling. So I think in the sense of a serial killer, if those sensibilities are beat down, and you lose a certain percentage of those sensibilities to drag you out of that and deal with the trauma, I think there's that too. I think some people lose the senses that enables them to fix the trauma, which can make it more massive to someone like a serial killer. Does that make sense? Because it is passed over after generation after generation. So you didn't know it. You had this feeling attached to you, right? So you're kind of drawn, because when you think about law of attraction, tone attracts tone, right? So the person putting it out probably is going through something themselves, and you're responding because it's the same thing.
Yeah. And to bring us back to police work, when we have all that going on in our mind as an individual, me and other people that probably have it, we utilize it to solve crimes. We utilize it to survive in the streets. I was in all police shootings, and I survived all of them. I was in a shooting so close that I could feel the muzzle flash up heat on my face. It was night, and I couldn't see him. He just opened fire on me. I walked into it, and there it was. And so we use all these senses. And then when it's over, the incident's over, no one talks about those things. See, I have this bias about education. I think that we as a society look at kids and people and education, that they need to be educated like this, and you need to be within these barriers, when really the human mind is out here. It's much wider than we're allowed to think growing up, outside the box, that kind of stuff. And by doing that, by keeping people in the parameters, like, for instance, I couldn't learn to spell. I had trouble with numbers. When I read a credit card number off, I have to cover up half the numbers because they get jumbled with me. But, people say, well, how do you make it through life? Well, I happened to become a cop, and I didn't need that so much as I needed to figure out what's wrong with this room. I could walk in a crime scene, and I can see it and go back later in my mind and review it again and see something I didn't think of before. See, my mind saw it, but I didn't think about it. And so I can go back and look at that. And I think, as I told you last time, when I was undercover in the mafia, they had push button phones. So when I wore a wire and some of these people were making illegal calls, the three feds in the van could hear it. And then after we got out of the situation, they would go to, we had a war room in north of Las Vegas. There were about 12 federal agents from around the country, and I would drive around and meet them. They would play the voices back. And first thing I had to do was look at mugshots and DMV photos and match voices to pictures, because they can't see. I can see who they were. Once I did that, they put a phone in front of me, and I remember them asking me, you know the numbers they called, because they shipped some fraudulent material. We had to have an agent in that state go get it and book it in as evidence. So I said, let me see a phone. And now I couldn't tell you the number they called, but I can tell you the pattern they pushed. And I was probably right. I'm just guessing 60% of the time, but I was right enough that they got 200 blank grand jury subpoenas and closed down the biggest boiler room operation in the country.
Wow. Well, I mean, if you're calling back feelings, that's no different than an actor, right? Actors, talent has high sensibilities. So I think if you have a special ability, which is through your sensibilities, and certain sensibilities are pushed, like there's people who are auditory, there's people who can see, there's people who can feel, so if you think about that, a lot of people in entertainment business have mental illness. And the reason they're able to call back a character and break through that third wall and have that feeling to recreate that character is a very similar thing. You could have been a great actor. You know what I mean? I mean, it's a very similar process that when you think about it.
Yeah, I've had people tell me that, well, you must be a good actor if you can infiltrate. According to the Mob Museum and the Las Vegas Review Journal, they have a podcast called Mobbed Up: The Fight for Las Vegas. I'm in season 3 with Oscar Goodman, who is the mob lawyer, and he became the mayor of Las Vegas for 11 years. He played himself in Casino. And I met the Joe Pesci character. In the movie, he was called Frank Tont. And in real life, it was Tony Spilatro. So I had to meet him in a gentleman's club to go where I needed to get to this operation. And so people said, man, you must have been a good actor. You must have been a good actor. And I never said this to anyone, but in my mind, I thought, no, I'm not a good actor. I became that person, because if I was acting, we've seen movies with bad actors. And you go, that's a bad actor. So I don't feel like I was acting. I felt like in my mind, I became the person I needed to be to do the thing I needed to do. And one of the things I remember, I was talking to David Soul and I don't know if you remember Starsky and Hutch, Michael Glacier at a studio, and he wanted to do a piece that I had created. I've written for Paramount Pictures and HBO years ago. So I was trying to do an example, and I said, well, look at this. If you're a straight male, we still have the ability to fantasize and visualize us having a homosexual act, but we don't allow ourselves to do that. And we don't allow ourselves to do that for different reasons. It could be morals. It could be anything, insecurities, whatever it is. But we have the ability to do that. Mm-hmm. But once you do that, if you do cross that line, you're someone else. It's just a little bit of someone else. And that's how it is when you start trying to figure out how a murder suspect or a serial killer is killing. Why is he killing and cutting up these little kids? So you start to fantasize about it, think about it, but it's like a fantasy. You got to visualize what he was getting, what gratification he's getting out of it. And when you cross that line, you're never the same again, in my opinion.
No, I mean, I agree because, that aligns with what we just said about trauma too, because of that, if you have that lineage trauma and it's almost like a cancer, right? If you trigger that cancer, you're going to get cancer. If you trigger that trauma, depend on, how big that trauma you're carrying. It could turn into a big gash, right? So you're triggered, right? Now you're diving deeper into the situation because that's what you're feeling. And that's what you're going after. Well, I think that's when people lose their sensibilities. They just don't cross back over. They're not a non-conscious human being at that point. Because I talk about the non-conscious. It's like, what is, Mike Powell made of? And that is part of the law of attraction. There's your environment. There's your foundation, which is your non-conscious. And then there's your sensibilities. So you have information in all three, because if you understand your environment and you understand the vibrations you accept in your environment, and then just by our birth date alone, right? If you ever looked at feng shui, right? Sensibilities have not kicked in. Emotions have not kicked in. By the birth date alone, we can understand our environment and look and put this person, right, when they're born, right, and we can align them where their successes are. where their health is, where their financial success is. That's all given to us in our birthday.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
So add that to your education, right? I learned that with scientists when I talked to Avi Loeb and some of these other big scientists. Yeah, they're very limited. They're not that smart because they're in their one lane, right? So it's almost like a catering. You have to understand who's who, right? You got to understand the environment. You got to understand the unconscious, align them the right way. Now let's teach them about the sensibilities, right? Because if you teach people about the sensibilities, then you can eliminate the bad customer.
Yes, I agree. Sometimes I've talked to my therapist, what really controls us as human beings? Is it our conscious or is it our subconscious? And if our subconscious is traumatized, then you have trouble dealing in the world with your conscious level. And
that's where your programming is. If we told people that, hey, your subconscious is programmed to a certain age, and whatever that imprint is, your unconscious bias is going to play that out and override your non-conscious being of who you really are.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree with that. Writing these cop books has really brought all this that we're discussing about, I question in my mind. I knew a lot of it. I just never, looked at it and regurgitated it and talked to my therapist about it. She sees cops, a lot of homicide detectives. And the thing is now that it's come, to light, when I wrote my second book, The Fabulous Mickey Finn, my character, he's a Latino. Latino, born and raised in East LA, and he's trying to do the right thing in life. But he grew up in an environment where the right thing wasn't necessarily something you did every day. And he had a mother who was religious and went to church. So he's back and forth, and he's a detective doing these things that he believes is right. And he's trying to stay on the righteous road, but he struggles with it because of his subconscious.
Interesting. I mean, it's a lot simpler than I think we make it. And I think that unfortunately, I can talk to neuroscientists and they agree with this concept. They know that, how the mind has been hijacked and all that kind of stuff. But when you get past the neuroscientists, they I don't know, they go in la la land. It's like, you don't want to know the truth. You know what I'm saying? All these answers are coming to light. And I don't know, have you felt recently, and we can dig into the new book here in a second, have you felt recently like your sensibilities have heightened, because we're going through this transition on Earth, right? Where we've moved into this new frequency and a lot of the dark energy is going to be left behind. Have you felt personally different?
Yeah. I feel like I'm more aware of myself and I'm more aware of why I did what I did and how I did it. I've done other big cases. Military parts to Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. I infiltrated that organization out of Burbank, California. MX missile parts, C-130 landing gears, fighter jet parts. They're all going under DoD contract. And I was hired to find out how they're getting it out of the manufacturer when the manufacturer says we're not losing anything. And it was the FBI had all these manufactured parts that they seized in Hollywood, Florida, and in Chicago and in Libya, but they didn't know how they're getting out of the factory. And the factory says, we're not missing anything. So I was hired to go under in Los Angeles. Burbank is part of, close to Los Angeles. And I infiltrated that and found out how it happened. And there's a lot of things that in my field that I did. I almost felt like at times I was consumed by my subconscious because I was go. One case is done, I go to another case. I did a murder case in Louisiana, then I go to another case, and I was hired over here, hired over there, and I did these things, and it's almost like a robot that was moving forward using all these senses to put things together. And I never felt like I had time to, catch my breath and go away. Now that I've written the books, I feel like I'm in that place in my life where I can look back and say, maybe I shouldn't have done that. That's a little dangerous, or things like that, when you're
That's
young.
where that's probably, how you were trained, because I think we're put in situations where we're told we have to do things this way, right? And your non-conscious maybe going the opposite direction, but because you've been trained and told you have to do it this way, you press forward and you continue to do it this way because that's what you've been told to do. It's just like making a career choice and you don't feel comfortable with that career choice and you wake up and you've been there 20 years.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And your creativity with the writing and all that stems from those abilities as well.
Yes, I believe that too. Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting way to look at life. And unfortunately, we think of these things when we're older, and it would be nice if when we were young, we can see and understand these ways we probably handle life, a little differently.
Well, maybe that's your third book where you just focus on that. You know what I mean? Maybe you could figure out how to read, I'll have to send you one of Finding a Perfect Audience. And, there does need to be some type of reform with law enforcement, I think, and the way they do things. I think they got to rethink their model and to some extent.
Yeah, I wrote in my first book, if you don't mind me, I'll read it. It's like 2 paragraphs. And
go ahead.
It has to do with what we're talking about. I don't read, I don't write, I daydream. It can at times be consuming, all-consuming, exhausting, and an interruption in my life. That was until I turned 70 years old and my wife, Pauline, encouraged me, despite my learning differences, to write my first book, a memoir entitled Escaping the Kill Zone, My Journey from LAPD's Zebra Unit to Undercover Federal Operative in the Las Vegas Mafia. My memoir is a true crime journey through murders, shootouts, tragedy, undercover work in the mafia, and PTSD. And to my astonishment, rave reviews, speaking engagements, and being a finalist in a National Book Award. And although that should be enough to validate my life, it wasn't. My mind has always been consumed with the thought of LAPD Lieutenant Manny Ibarra, a fictional character that has lived with me for over 30 years. An alter ego, I suppose, the leading character in my reoccurring dream, possibly, but definitely a foil to my self-validation that has always eluded me. I wanted to be Manny. And then, in this novel, in these pages, he became me.
Wow.
So
interesting.
When I was writing this character, because it's fictional, I'm drawing from other people that I know, other cops, other crimes, and that kind of stuff. I realized that I was inserting in his character myself and what I believe in, and it became interesting.
Interesting. So talking about the new book, you kind of touched on it there for a minute. Tell us a little bit about the new book.
Well, the new book is, without giving a lot of it away, the book opens up in jail. Manny Ibarra, my lead character, is in jail. Well, Manny's head of SIS. It's a very aggressive unit that was started in the 60s, and they were there to stop really bad guys. And one of the things that looked good on paper was that, when someone went in a bank to rob the bank and they pulled out a gun and then you arrested them, well, they didn't quite rob the bank yet. You get them for attempted robbery, armed robbery. And then they plea that down and they get a very small sentence. So SIS was put together to allow them to tail them. They tailed bad guys. They knew who the bank robbers were. They knew who the violent people were, and they tailed them, surveillance. And then when they went into a bank to rob it, they allowed them to rob the bank. And then when they came outside, that's where the confrontation started. And as I said, it looks good on paper, but most of those guys never made it to court. He's in charge. The true part of SIS, it's no longer doing what it used to do. LA Times, I think, called it the death squad back then. So my character, Manny Ibarra, Lieutenant Manny Ibarra, is in charge of that unit. And when his brother is killed, his brother, Sergeant Frank, Detective Frank Ibarra, he seeks revenge on the gang that killed him, and bodies start dropping across the city. And one of his guys ends up getting caught planting a gun on one of the gang members, and they want Manny to testify, the grand jury, and he defies the grand jury subpoena. He won't even show up. So they fire him, loses his pension, and ends up in county jail for a year. And when he gets out, he has to start his life over as a private detective. And former military, he's having nightmares from his, Marine Corps recon unit, and they did some tier 1 operations overseas that are classified. And his whole unit ultimately ended up perishing, and he was the only one to survive. So he's having, problems with that. And he's getting his life together when a beautiful blonde walks into his office, turns his world upside down.
Interesting. Well, think about that and give us the full name and where we can find the book, the new book.
The book is called The Fabulous Mickey Finn. I don't know if people are aware. A Mickey Finn is basically a Mickey, or a Mickey Finn is, in the old days, some women of dubious character would drop an elixir, a powder, a pill into a gentleman's drink, rendering him unconscious, taking him somewhere, and then robbing him. And so I thought it would be interesting if the elixir is a beautiful blonde. So she comes into his world and takes him, he falls in love with her, they fall in love, and she takes him down a long road throughout the whole book as he's doing other cases involved in shootings and stuff that is not a real world. And he was set up.
Well, I was thinking about the military thing because I got a few friends. This female that was a comedian, she spent 5 tours in Afghanistan, and, think about your sensibilities in military and just the heavy metal, right? And the sounds and the pounding and all that. And you're this nimble of sensibility, right? And you're putting this in this shock in all environment, Think about what that's going to do to someone who's a very highly sensitive, maybe special person that's put into the military world.
Yeah. One of the things I just recently talked to my therapist about is because people asked me when I was undercover with the mafia, when I did these things, was I afraid? And I wasn't. I was basically shut off from emotion. And so I said to her, when you're frightened and you become fearful, certain chemicals kick off in your body and does certain things to your body. What if you've learned to shut that off, like a lot of military guys do, a lot of cops do? You shut that off. Do the chemicals still react? Is there a delayed reaction to your trauma, delayed trauma to you after it's done? And I believe there is, because, PTSD, alcoholism, drug abuse, suicide.
Well, you harbor because, I do the same thing because I had a crazy, bad childhood and I've had no fear. I've had no fear, and I'm always even though I've gone through this enlightenment, I think when you get to that point, you internalize a lot of stuff. And you have a very strong mind to be able to do that. But I think you still have to work those pockets of what you internalized out of your body so it doesn't continue to have an effect on you. Because I'm still working with that on every day.
Yeah, I spoke at a luncheon. The governor was actually in the front row. He was the chief then. The sheriff of Nevada. Las Vegas. And we had a bunch of former CIA guys show up and talk to me, and Justice Department, FBI, and stuff like that. And that subject came up when I was speaking, and I said, it just came out of me. I said, fear are like taxes. You're going to either pay them now or you're going to pay for them later. You can hold them off. You can shut off from the world. You can say, I wasn't afraid. I'm not fearful, whatever. But someday you're going to have to pay your taxes.
I think if we can have people like you and a lot of these other, special people that have these things being shown to them, I think, there's stuff that's being shown to me that kind of like, wow. And I think that's the new world we're moving into. And maybe some of these things will change moving forward because it seems like the thought process is, you know what I mean? Well, it's always a great conversation with Mr. Mike Powell. I could keep talking and talking and talking because it's weird how things are more linear in life than we realize. And he's got some great books out there, Escaping the Kill Zone and The Fabulous Mickey Finn. Check out those books. You can get them on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. This has been Mr. Mike J Powell, and I'm John Edmonds Kozma, CEO of Bang Productions, owner of the TikTok Live Creator Network Agency, and host of the Unimpressed Podcast. We'll see y'all next time.